it's connecting to the cloud server. Okay, so it's busy recording. So welcome everyone to the fourth live session. This one's about regarding module 4 and appropriate technology. And we're starting off as usual with getting a better understanding of the carbon cycle and its relevance to energy systems. And then we start digging into technology for the generation and use of energy, looking at sustainable design of carbon neutral energy systems, and then looking at energy technologies as part of a resilience strategy for sustainable communities and eco-villages. And then we don't really cover scaling and this up to where you are in your locality or your bioregion, but we in the give us
you need live. Okay. We're doing live sessions beginning every week is more to holistic look at climate, carbon, really important, included, very poorly understand what the scientists are talking about, and very often they're talking about things in millions and billions and trillions of this and that and the other, and the numbers are so big. And then they're talking about all sorts of technologies as well, and it just becomes paralyzing. And yet we have to make, as individuals, as communities, as activists, putting pressure on our government, some very, very important decisions. So it's really important that we get this right. So I just thought I would run over a few things. And the first slide, I took some information from one of my favorite climate scientists. He's actually an engineer, Professor Kevin Anderson. Now, he came to Edinburgh last October when the IPCC published the last quite devastating report saying, help everybody, this is really urgent. And he came and gave a talk at the invitation of Friends of the Earth Scotland to the Scottish Government. And then he came to Edinburgh University afterwards and gave us a talk there. It's not the first time I've seen him talk. And what I like about him very much is he's very honest, he's very critical, and he really goes into areas that we wouldn't otherwise get to know about. He's very critical, but it's not of the science itself, and it's not of the scientists. As he says, the scientists in the IPCC, or the scientists who offer their work for inclusion in the IPCC reports, are people who are working with integrity. What he's talking about is the way that the IPCC reports are framed, that the influences that come from the economists and the engineers, the people developing technology that are also working with them to influence the type of proposals they make for solutions. And of course, what's very important as a background here is the World Economic Forum, or as Kevin Anderson calls them, the Davos set, because the World Economic Forum meets at the ski resort Davos in Switzerland once a year. And they have a very important influence on what the IPCC suggests as solutions to the problem, and even the framing of the problem itself. Who are the Davos set? Well, basically, they are the CEOs and other high functionaries in the corporations and the banks and the international institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization, and they all meet together with the politicians, as I have just mentioned, once a year at Davos, which is now becoming really quite a big, it's almost like a circus. They're surrounded, as Kevin Anderson points out here, by what he calls the climate glitterati. And these are people who are very well-known figures, like Nicholas Stern, who wrote the report for Britain, the first report on climate for Britain, and Christina Figueres, who was appointed by the United Nations to oversee the COP. Al Gore, of course, who's very well known for his activism and his films. The billionaire Bloomberg, who is also very prominent in the media. And as Anderson points out, these are actually very high emitting individuals making the climate headlines, and they're supported by a cadre of senior climate academics. So that there are people, as Anderson says it, who really like to rub shoulders with the glitterati, and you can add to that now some rock stars like Bono and some prominent film stars like, what's he called, Leonardo DiCaprio, who are becoming very outspoken about what we should do in terms of solving the climate problem, while they have massive climate impacts, massive climate footprints themselves. What they are proposing are all technological. So offsetting, well, that's not maybe quite so technological, because what it really means is that you can carry on living your lifestyle, but if you plant enough trees, you're offsetting your carbon emissions. Then the negative emissions technology, which is a very vague sort of way of putting something, but that's probably because it actually doesn't exist at the moment. Anderson is pretty insistent, and he's an engineer himself, that these technologies only exist in the fantasy world of some of the engineers who are hanging out with the climate glitterati. Then, of course, there's geoengineering, which I find personally very scary because it cannot be tested in the laboratory. So it's, you know, if they decide that they are going to drop iron filings in the oceans in order to oxidize them, or if they're going to start spraying chemicals to whiten the clouds and reflect the sun, there's no way they can test the impact of this beforehand. So it's incredibly risky, but they are proposing it. And I have been reading recently that they are preparing to do some of the first tests to spray high up in the atmosphere. I think this one is about trying to mimic volcanoes to reflect some of the solar radiation back. Then you have carbon capture and storage. There is some technology for this that does exist, but as Anderson points out, it has not been upscaled out of the lab. Recent developments in Switzerland, they have built a machine that's a little bit bigger, but they are nowhere near the technology which would capture the amount of the amount of carbon that we need to draw down. And then we have green growth. Now, Anderson is a very fervent critic of growth as one of the main drivers of the problem. And Ezio is going to mention this later on. And of course, if you go on to do the economic dimension, you will be dealing with problems around growth as well. Even if it is so-called green growth, which you could call greenwashing growth, all of the proposed growth, which is around renewable energy infrastructures and electric cars, and electric aeroplanes, and passive houses, all of this stuff, you know, if you're going to do it at scale, which is going to supposedly generate jobs, it's going to have a major impact on the resources of the planet and on planetary health. It will be very degrading. So none of these options really that are being proposed are actually very viable if we want to continue to have an industrial scale agriculture, which is really what the Davos paradigm is about. It's about continuing with business as usual while using some energy types which are supposedly cleaner. One of my favorite quotes from Anderson is, it's about incremental evolution within the system. We mustn't question the system. So this is a system of economic growth, which has been the problem right from the beginning. I stole this little rather satirical cartoon also from Kevin Anderson's last lecture, because I think what he's mainly saying is that most of these people, even if they are completely well-meaning and really do want to solve the problems, they are so wealthy, they live in a bubble. And that means that they can have people around them that tell them what they want to hear, and they have no idea what it's like to really live in the real world. So this is the background against which we personally as individuals and communities trying to negotiate our way through the energy problem and to make decisions about what type of energy we are going to invest in for our own future. So next slide, please, Ezio. First of all, I think it's a good idea of asking ourselves, what is carbon? Because there's so much talk about it these days. You know, there's too much of it up there. We have to get rid of it. It's poisoning the atmosphere. I mean, it's starting to sound as if people think that carbon is like a pesticide. It's toxin. It's a pollutant. We have to get rid of it. We have to stick it somewhere deep in the ground and never let it out again. But, you know, is that really the right way of looking at carbon? Because carbon is really essential for all life on this planet. The plan that is being used by the British government is called Carbon Zero Britain, and it was drawn up by an alternative energy, a Centre for Alternative Technology in Wales. But, you know, it seems strange to call something Carbon Zero Britain. We can never be carbon. You know, 27% of my body is actually carbon. We are a carbon-based life form. So I think that we also need to be better informed about what we're talking about before we can really understand the issues and start to make decisions. So, you know, carbon is everywhere. It's one of the most flexible elements. It can bond with other elements to make all sorts of different molecule chains. It can be a gas, it can be a solid, it can be compressed into liquids. When it's under pressure, of course, it's a diamond, which is the hardest substance on the planet. Also, you know, has industrial uses, not just the uses of very expensive things for movie stars, but, you know, it can be used to cut industrial processes to cut things. Then on the other hand, it can be very soft when it's compressed, like graphite, which is what you have in your pencil. Sorry, I've got a bit of a cold here. And it bonds with calcium and oxygen to make chalk, which we can write on blackboards. It bonds with oxygen to make CO2. It bonds with hydrogen to make methane. It bonds with hydrogen and oxygen to make carbohydrates, which are really what we eat. You know, wheat flour is a carbohydrate molecule chain. So is glucose. So is fructose, sucrose, all of those things that are so important in our diet. There's a large amount of carbon in there. Carbon is extremely important as organic matter. also called biomass, which means living matter, which is in plants and animals, including ourselves. 27% of our body is carbon. And also necromass, which is the dead organic matter. And these two, biomass and necromass, are what we call humus, which is in the soil. And that is a very important part of the soil because it is there also to hold the moisture so that when it rains, more of the rainwater sinks into the soil and through into the aquifers instead of running off. Next slide, please, Ezio. So where is all of this carbon? Well, if you look at it like this, actually, you can find it a little bit overwhelming how much of it there is around, because it's in the rock and sediment in the deep ocean, it's in the terrestrial rock, large quantities of it, but any type of movement of carbon exchange in the oceans, the deep ocean and in the rock is so slow that it is imperceptible in a human framework. Then, of course, you have this little red spot there, which is the amount of fossil fuels. They're embedded in the rock, and that is actually the energy of a sun that burned 300 million years ago and was captured through photosynthesis. So it's always worth bearing that in mind, that this is what fossil fuels are. They are the product of photosynthesis. Then at the top you have the carbon that is part of the exchange of gases and materials, all brought about by life. So you have it in the soil, in plants, in the air, in the shallow ocean. It's life in the oceans. And there's a tiny bit up there which is released, fossil carbons released by us through our burning of fossil fuels. Next slide, please. Some more carbon data. If we look at this graph in the bottom left-hand corner, this gives a very schematic indication of how carbon moves around in the atmosphere when there's no intervention from our human industrial processes involved. So it's a balance of inputs and outputs, and it's a materially closed cycle which takes about 3 years to complete, with 120 gigatons of carbon a year going down into the plants. They are drawn down by trees and other plants. 60 gigatons of carbon goes back up into the atmosphere when the plants breathe out or when they die. 60% goes into the soil. The soil gives up 60% back into the atmosphere again, and the ocean is stable at 70 in and 70 out. So that is before we come along with our big red box here, and we start chucking 8.3 gigatons of carbon a year from burning fossil fuels and from environmental degradation, because when we cut down forests and burn them, when we cut fields and burn the stubble, or we're putting the carbon back into the atmosphere. So before we started burning the fossil fuels in the pre-industrial period, there was about 280 ppm in the atmosphere, more or less stably, going backwards and forwards between hotter periods and in the interglacial period. So between about 180 and 280 ppm over really long periods of the planet's history. So it's a very slow cycle. But then we come along, and by 2017, it has already gone up to 405 ppm. I think I read the other day that it's now 409.98. So that's quite a big difference. That really actually means that there's a lot that has got to come down. So how are we actually going to draw this down? What is the IPCC saying? They're talking about carbon sequestration options. And while they recognize that there is such a thing as terrestrial sequestration, which means that life forms, the plant life can draw carbon out of the atmosphere, what they're really proposing is more technology. And this is a technology that really doesn't exist at scale outside the laboratory. They are proposing to use this technology to filter carbon dioxide out of the industrial process, so power stations, and to put it down into deep under the ground. So oil wells are now empty because all of the oil has been drained out of them, or most of it, into coal mines that can no longer be used because the seams are not productive, and other such like spaces underground. I have heard briefly, but I don't know much about it, that there is talk of developing a technology for pressing the carbon dioxide into rock, but that sounds quite drastic to me. The bottom diagram shows the system that they are calling BECCS, which stands for Biofuel Energy with Carbon Capture and Storage. So in this, they are recognizing that the trees in the on the left-hand side there are drawing down carbon dioxide as they grow. But what they are planning to do is to plant cash crop forests of monocropping, maybe even GMOs, because they have developed GMO eucalyptus and GMO pine that grows very quickly. And they have planted these in Portugal, which is possibly one of the reasons that the forest fires in Portugal in 2017 were quite so devastating, because these trees are very dry because they're very quick growing. However, the plan is that once the trees have matured in 20 or 30 years, they cut them down, they're turned into biomass, they go into a power station to generate electricity. When they have been burned, the carbon is captured by this as yet non-existent technology, and it's then buried deep in the ground. Some of it will be converted to biofuels for transport. And it's possible, of course, as well, that they could develop the technology to compress the gas, which would make it easier to store it. But as yet, they don't quite have the technology. And obviously, growing trees to cut them down and to burn them doesn't strike me as being a very, a very eco-friendly solution. There's also a lot of scandal. There have been a lot of scandals around this. There's been a lot of corruption. One example which Oxfam brought to light a few years ago was that the power station in Britain called Drax, which has been taken over by an American company and has been receiving massive subsidies from the European Union for a transition to renewable energy, has been taking that money and burning wood chips, which they claim are sustainable, but it was discovered that the wood chips actually come from America, so they're transported all the way to England from America, and they were actually, they're coming from logging in old forests. They're not coming from these forests that are plantations. So it's very environmentally degrading. Next slide, please, Ezio. Okay, so some more carbon data. We're talking about 1 ppm. What exactly does this mean? So it's 1 part per million by atmospheric volume of CO2. Well, that doesn't sound like a great deal. That's okay, isn't it? Just 1 part per million. That sounds really, really like a tiny bit. But what is the reality behind that seemingly small amount? I'm not going to go through all of the calculations because there are quite a lot of them. And if you want to know more of them, you can look at the video that I give the reference later on. It's from Tony Lovell, who is very good at number crunching, and he gives all the numbers. But 1 kilo of CO2, because it's a gas, is very voluminous. You would need a tank of 505.8 litres just to hold 1 kilo of CO2. And with the geological carbon capture and storage, they're proposing to store the entire CO2 molecule. So that is going to be a lot of litres of storage space. If you compress it to graphite and store it at room temperature, then 1 kilo is actually, it's less than half a litre, so about the size of a small water bottle. And that sounds like a much better idea, because 1 kilo of CO2 needs 1,147 times more space than carbon. So if you compress it, then you don't. Is somebody asking a question? Because I can hear a lot of people talking. No? Okay, good. Compressing it sounds like a good idea, except when you realize that if you compress it into liquid for storage, for example, you would need to use 20% of the energy outputs from your power station just to do the compressing. So that presents us with another problem. That 1 part per million by volume of atmospheric CO2 is actually 7.8 billion tons of CO2. Here's where we get into all these big figures that just paralyze because they're so big we can't really comprehend them. That's 2.1 billion tons of carbon. And if you want to know what it looks like, it will be a lump of graphite that would be 1 kilometer long by 1 kilometer broad by 1 kilometer deep. So 1 cubic kilometer of graphite. And what does that look like? Well, the picture below shows you more or less what it would look like. Ayers Rock in Australia is approximately 1 cubic kilometer. So how many of those are actually up there? Every time we hear that our the carbon up there has gone up by 1 part per million, which sounds very small. That is actually what has gone up there. It's that much carbon. And we have more than 100 of those to bring down. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Everybody's heard of the Keeling curve, because this was really where the whole debate about climate change or CO2 emissions started. And you can see that it goes increasingly upward from the 60s right the way up there to 2010. But it's not a straight line. It's a sort of an up and down wobbly line, as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, the annual cycle. So why is it going up and down like that all of the time? Well, what we are seeing here is the annual cycle. 15 billion tons of carbon cycling due to seasonal photosynthesis. So in the summer, when the deciduous trees have leaves and they start photosynthesizing, they draw 15 billion tons of carbon out of the atmosphere. But then, of course, when they stop photosynthesizing in the winter, they drop all of that again. So the carbon content goes up. So that's really interesting, because it's what we call biological carbon capture and storage, and it's carried out by photosynthesis, which splits the carbon from the oxygen molecules. And so the oxygen is released back into the atmosphere and we breathe it, and the carbon is stored in the tree. So what if we could improve on that? Now, Tony Lovell, who is the co-founder of Sustainable Land Management Australia, he's worked out that 1 hectare of land is 10,000 square meters. If you have soil that's 33.5 centimeters deep and that the bulk density is 1.4 tons, the soil mass per hectare is 4.7 tons, and just a 1% change in soil organic matter would be 47 tons, which is 27 tons of soil carbon and 100 tons of atmospheric CO2, which are actually drawing down. Last week, Ezio talked about this as well. He was citing Dr. Christine Jones, who's also an Australian, a soil scientist, and she was citing how much you would sequester if you pull down 4% into the humus in the soil. So those are really very interesting statistics. We have to, I think, bear in mind, and we also have to bear in mind that the IPCC is more or less aware of this, because in 2007, they were saying that carbon sequestration in agricultural soils has a mitigation potential of 1 to 4 billion tons of CO2 a year, that the potential for mitigation in soil has been underestimated, and that 70% of potential land is in developing countries. So there are some really potential interesting developments if we take that on board. Next slide, please, Ezio. Thank you. So why is this not happening? Now, the Paris Agreement stated very quickly, the agreement was to undertake rapid reductions in accordance with the best science and on the basis of equity. So if we were to look at it from the perspective that globally there are 5 billion hectares of degraded grassland, much of it in developing countries, and if we paid farmers for sequestration of carbon in their soils, we would alleviate poverty. We would also be increasing biomass and biodiversity, water retention capacity, restore entire ecosystems, and provide nutrient-rich food. So why is this not happening? Kevin Anderson is also very keen on critiquing the World Economic Forum, the Davos set. He says that no country takes any notice of the equity issue, not in the Western world, it's all just lip service. And that's a quote I took from his last lecture, which I attended. He also cites the Pope's encyclical, which he says is, I mean, he's not a Catholic, he's not even religious, but he says that the Pope is really one of the people who's more clued in than most people when it comes to understanding the situation. And the Pope says in his encyclical, the alliance of technology and economics ends up sidelining any issues unrelated to its immediate interests. So that rather satirical cartoon about Davos, again, about inequality, I think we need to think about these things when we're making decisions about our activism as climate change activists, the decisions that we make on our own particular use of energy, our own consumption of resources, and so forth, because we need equity. Last slide for me, please, Edio. So just to round it off, I broached some of the issues around appropriate technology so that it's not just technology, it fits into a perspective which will work towards looking for solutions to climate change, which are holistic. And I think that we have to do it, I like to do it anyway, from the perspective of the permaculture ethics. When I'm making decisions, I think about earth care, about what the impacts of my decisions, including my decisions for energy, are going to have on the earth. And I would prefer ecosystem restoration. What about people care? We need to ensure that we have a healthy environment and well-being for everybody and not just greenwashing. And fair shares, equity. We have to share the earth's resources with everybody. And we have to be quite sparing in the use of resources. I don't believe that we should be advocating for an industrial society run on 100% of renewables when that is going to use up so much of the earth's resources and the precious metals and everything, that there is going to be nothing left for anybody else. So I put in here a couple of interesting links. For example, there's this one in the bottom left-hand corner is to a scientific study on ecosystem services, which is a big word at the moment. So that's really important when we're thinking about using biodiversity, and also when we're thinking about using biomass, if we're going to use have biofuels. Are we using ecosystem services in a way which is reciprocal, or do we just see them as resources that will be there forever, renewable for us? What about the rare earths at a glance? Because everything we will need in appliances and wind turbines, wave turbines, solar power, photovoltaic, we're going to need to have rare earths in the batteries and stuff like that. We have to think seriously about the biofuels, because the European Union's biofuel directive, which insists that 5% of all of the diesel tanked at petrol stations is also 5% of it is actually biofuel. And this is proving to be a terrible mistake, one that came about from lobbying from the biofuel industry. Part of that is palm oil. Part of it, of course, is bioethanol from maize, which is, competing with agricultural land. And they're also chopping down the Amazon to create fields to grow maize, and that is being turned into biofuel. So we really need to be very, very careful when we make these decisions, that they're going to be genuine holistic solutions. So I put down there some links to places where you can find the information that I've given, all of those awful stats with big numbers. Right at the bottom, there's an article by Jason Hickel, who's professor of economics at the London School of he's an anthropologist at the London School of Economics, and he is a huge critic of the idea of green growth. So there are some articles there for you to read and check up if you want to. And now over to SEO.
Thank you, Jacqueline. I think you provided the essential backdrop to understanding why we need to pursue renewable energies and also carbon neutral design. So related to this topic, more than 10 years ago, Professor Charles Hall from the State University of New York, him and his colleagues, they started putting together research regarding biophysical economics. So the easiest way to explain this is, imagine a cheetah in the savannas of Africa, or any predator really. But focus on the cheetah, it's quite easy to figure this out. A cheetah probably has a good 100-meter sprint worth of energy after a good meal that's been digested after a couple of days. And then it's starting to think about the next meal. It's got a couple of offspring that it needs to feed. And now it starts zooming in on its prey, and it makes the dash to pull something down. Now, if it's got a 100-meter sprint in it, and then it's physically exhausted after that, What happens if it doesn't pull down its prey in that 100-meter sprint? Can you imagine? It can't feed itself. It can't even look after its offspring. So the next time, once it's recovered, I doubt it'll be able to sprint 100 meters again, maybe 70 meters, who knows? But in any event, whatever amount of energy it derives from the prey that it's brought down, it must be sufficient so that it pays for its own maintenance, it pays for its offspring, and it sustains the cheetah's family livelihood. So in a similar vein, this is what these researchers, Charles Hall and his colleagues, started looking at. And they started devising a couple of metrics for the energy return on energy invested ratio, or it's also known as the net energy return. So looking at the graph on the top left-hand corner, the first red column you see there is domestic oil, domestic meaning it's in reference to the United States. So around about 1930, the energy return was in excess actually of 100 to 1. So in other words, imagine those nodding donkeys that used to pump the oil out of these oil fields. Now in those days when they discovered the oil was virtually bleeding out the ground. It was near the surface. So they used to hit Pandora's box just under the surface. So for an energy return equivalent of 1 barrel of oil that was used to use for the nodding donkey, pay for all the labor, the drilling, etc., they used to get an excess of 100 barrels in return. Now that was Pandora's energy box, and that's what got the whole economic system up and running. Now let's look what happened from the 1930s. So follow that red column, just follow all the red columns here. So around about 1970, the imported oil from Saudi Arabia and other sources was only returning less than 40 to 1 equivalent. Its own domestic oil in the oil fields of Texas and the Gulf and all that had dropped from 100 to 1 to less than 40 to 1. That was in the 1970s. And that's when we had the oil crisis. Then around about 2005, look how it had dropped even further to about 35 to 1. And then in 2000, it was sitting at about 10 to 1. So from less than 100 years ago, it dropped from 100 to 1 energy return to about 10 to 1. What does that tell us? Let's start comparing oil, which has been an incredible energy bonanza, with other forms of energy. So here we have hydroelectric sitting at about 40 to 1. This is average. Firewood is pretty static, 25 to 30 to 1. Wind is doing quite well, 25 to 30 to 1 return. Natural gas above 10 to 1. Nuclear is sitting probably 10 to 15 to 1. But I also feel that some of the cost elements of nuclear haven't been fully factored in. For example, using net present value, which is an accounting way of the further your costs are into the future, the less relevant they are now, throws a spanner in the works with nuclear energy, because when you dismantle that nuclear plant, there are huge costs towards the end of its life cycle. So how can we discount that cost pretty flimsily in accounting terms? So it's up there for debate. Now, solar voltaic seems very low there. And indeed it was. This was a graph from about 10 years ago. And I've yet in all my research found an equivalent graph that brings these type of statistics up to date. But independent research has showed that the solar voltaic energy return on energy invested has risen significantly. This is because the costs of this energy have dropped substantially through research and everything. And this is starting to be a pretty viable renewable energy form. Now let's look at the tar sands here. The tar sands, they're sitting, I'd say, probably 10 to 1, but in reality, they are less than 5 to 1. if they're lucky, they're about 3 to 1. Now, the tar sands is the author of Transition Town, the first book that came out. I think it was Rob Hopkins, who was one of the co-authors there. They have an interesting skit on the tar sands. And I'll just sidetrack a bit now to give you an idea what tar sands is all about. So imagine these Irish fellows who go to their famous pub every week, and they get there on a Friday evening, and the Guinness barrel is dry. There's not a drop left there. Now they're pretty anxious to scrape the barrel here, but there's nothing left there. So in their stupor, they figure out that there's been so many pints of Guinness that have been spilt onto that the carpet in that pub, that maybe it's worthwhile ripping the carpet up, boiling it and extracting the droplets of Guinness that they can from there, and that might just squeeze out a pint or two. So that gives you an idea of the severity of the tar sands. They basically scrape the boreal forest clean. They then need steam to process all the shallow soils that are full of tar. And so they need dams, they need energy, which they import to provide steam to extract this process. So the energy involved in generating energy is just ludicrous. And then the absolute joke of it all is the biodiesel crops, where on average, the average biodiesel crop is barely above one, meaning that for 1 unit of energy, you need about 1.5 return. And whereas ethanol is generally negative, the only reason they go for ethanol is that in the Amazon, they can plant sugarcane, which derives ethanol, and the cost of the Amazon is being laughed off virtually. So biofuel crops have got relatively low returns. There are some biofuel crops that have relatively better returns, like tragically the palm oil, and then jatropha, which are uploaded onto the additional handouts. But this is a very, very important concept to grasp, the energy return on energy invested. So remember this concept, because we'll come back to this time and time again. Moving on a bit, let's continue this thought of energy return on energy invested and related to collapse and sustainability. Now, one of Charles Hall's colleagues who presented at this first biophysical conference 10 years ago in 2009, Joseph A. Tainter, I've uploaded 2 of these presentations on the additional handouts. But here's one very interesting slide of his. He looked at complexity, societal complexity, and energy return on energy invested. And he drew parallels between the Roman Empire and the USA. And they figured out that the more complex a society, the more energy it needs to use. So if you look at how complexity has grown within our society, pre-industrial era, and right up to the present context, we've become highly, highly sophisticated. And so Tainter and his colleagues figured out that an energy return on energy invested of about 5 to 1 is the minimum that's required to sustain a complex society. They have been criticized that this is too low, and the critiques are saying we need at least 10 to 1. Now let's just go a slide back and see which of these energy returns are yielding more than 10 to 1. Very, very few of them. It's wind, it's firewood, oil is less than that now, solar voltaic is less than that, biodiesel crops are less than that. So what's that telling us as a strong message is that we need to downshift. We need to shift urgently to renewable energy sources and make do with less. Now, some of these other folk that have come along, have done their research. Here's this guy, Mark Jacobson. He's adamant that just by using wind, water, and sunlight energy. So that's your wind power, your wind turbine, your hydroelectric, and your solar energy is more economical than BAU, is your business as usual. Oops. And that is more than viable to convert to, instead of the business as usual, which is plan A that we normally refer to. Now, let's look at this interesting collage of countries that have made the shift to renewable energy. Here's India, Scotland is coal-free, Denmark, Uruguay, almost relying totally on renewable energy. Portugal managed to achieve that for a couple of straight days, probably when the wind was howling off the Atlantic. Costa Rica has managed to do that. So it can be done. It's not too difficult. And then there's the Post-Carbon Institute. They were pretty dramatic in their peak oil documentaries, but they have provided a lot of inspiring ideas in resilience.org, which run training courses on how to establish resilient economies, communities, and so forth. But by far, one of my sources of inspiration of how we can downshift and live with less is Plan C. Now, this is the title of a book called Plan C, Community Survival Strategies for Peak Oil and Climate Change. Its author is Pat Murphy, and he's from the Community Solutions NGO. So they were the same producers as the Cuba documentary on peak oil. So Plan C is based on curtailment. So in other words, shrinking back our consumption, establishing a sense of community and cooperation. So instead of competition, which is so often taught at schools through athletics and sports, we need to adopt this approach of cooperation, which was Steiner's approach. So cooperation versus competition. So these are strategies for survival, for surviving the energy descent future. So I've also put in there, by the way, Plan A is the business as usual economic growth model coming out of Davos and those type of places. Plan B is Lester Brown's policies from a website of his called Earth Policies Institute, which is very techno-green solution fix, very closely aligned to Plan A, almost trying to sustain the same type of economic growth as Plan A, but with high-tech green solutions, which the critique is it's too little, too late. So here along comes Plan C, which is all about curtailment, community, and cooperation. And by the way, Plan D is called die off, and this is not an option. But some also see Plan D as survival islands or the prepper movement. But at what cost are they doing this? Moving on now, how can we apply some of these ideas? Because this module is really scraping the surface of energy solutions. We don't delve into the engineering issues. One would need to go and study that at a technikon or university, but we hope to convey the main message about energy. So how can we use this type of information as in an advocacy type example or as an activist? So the example I've used here comes from several years ago, where in 2010 there was the BP Gulf oil disaster, or the Deep Horizon disaster. And I developed a couple of scenarios around this, which I'd like to share with you. And think about this technique, because you can use this technique for a lot of other issues in your life, your personal life, or to challenge a project or whatever. So imagine if you choose two very critical themes or issues around a particular problem. So the Gulf oil disaster led one to thinking about curtailment of deep sea drilling, or does one keep on expanding it? Because remember, before that disaster happened, they also struck Pandora's box in that Gulf, and they didn't know how to cap it. So there was really too much oil coming out of there. They didn't know how to control that. But at the same time, they didn't think of the ecological disasters that could come off it. So we've got the two extremities now, curtailment or expansion. And we juxtapose those against, imagine if we have a proactive government with strong new environmental legislation, or a reactive government with ambivalent environmental legislation. Now let's just explore these four scenarios that could materialize, depending on what position your leaders actually take you to. So we have a sensible scenario. Now what happens in a sensible scenario? Well, you have a lower ecological footprint because you curtail deep sea drilling, and you have proactive government with very strong legislation. So you minimize the risk of a similar environmental calamity. You reduce the need for extreme disaster management preparation. There's lower taxes to pay for disaster management readiness. There's the increased likelihood of redirected investment towards renewable energies. And generally, there's this lower ecological footprint. What happens on the opposite extreme? We're looking at ecocide. And ecocide happens when there's a very real threat to human existence. So we have, remember that in this quadrant, we have an expansion of deep sea drilling because there's all these promises of extraordinary yields in the deep ocean, but with a reactive government, meaning very weak legislation and policy. So we have very lax and corrupt environmental approvals, increased deep sea drilling, especially within or nearby third world waters, unresponsive disaster management systems, increased risk of concurrent disasters and lack of resources, major global environmental risk, permanent damage to fragile ecosystems, great financial risk, increased cost to the energy end user, and the increasing ecological energy footprint. Now, there are also two other scenarios here. We have a techno approach where you have very tough environmental legislation in keeping with your proactive government, but you continue expanding. So what happens here? Your risk increases, but you pass on that risk through extra disaster management readiness. There's extra taxes to pay for all this, extra insurance costs, and extra energy costs to the end user. So it's not really viable. And the other scenario, I've just called it a muddy scenario, basically where very little change in the global energy footprint, because there is a lot of curtailment, and this is voluntary reduction of deep sea drilling due to environmental activism, which is good. But there's reduced environmental risk to oceans. But because there's weak government response here, there remains ambivalent disaster management readiness. So in all likelihood, you'll find that the investments that would otherwise go into deep sea drilling go into tar shales, low-grade coals, biofuels, and so forth. And also resource wars against the weaker countries that have got the oil. And then you end up paying higher taxes. So in this way, you start charting your way to say, let's move away from this muddy ecocidal techno response and move our policies towards a sensible environment, which is curtailment with strong government environmental policy. And lastly, think about the precautionary principle. This one hints at, this is not a defining statement, but it's just a statement that it's making. Preventing damage before catastrophe happens is much cheaper than fixing up the mess afterwards. So don't get in that situation in the first place. Now, luckily, I've done the spade work for this scenario. And in South Africa right now, they've discovered, they call it wet gas bonanza, which is about 200 kilometers offshore. It's about 3.6 to 4 kilometers deep into the ocean. And it's in an area of the ocean which is susceptible to extreme winds, pressure systems, weather systems moving up and down. Is just waiting for a disaster to happen. So I'm going to put something together in this manner to try and raise awareness about why they shouldn't go ahead with that deep sea drilling for gas off the South African coastline. But here is just an example. You can customize this to suit whatever, if you've got a fracking problem in Texas or wherever, you can just tweak the axes along this and develop the scenarios accordingly. It's a very powerful tool to use in a workshop scenario where you can have breakaway groups to develop each scenario and then a feedback, and then at least there's full community participation in this process. So moving on then, given the extreme necessity to think about energy in a different light, that it's a scarce resource, that we need to use it sparingly. And the whole transition movement is quite amazing in how it's taken a long view to say, instead of having what government normally prepares are economic development plans, along comes the transition movement and develops an energy descent action plan. In other words, instead of showing how you're going to grow your economy for the next 20 years, let's be realistic and address how with less oil, how we need to descend gracefully so that we don't fall off the edge of a cliff. So Totnes was one of the first towns in the world that put together an energy descent action plan. And there's been lots of other transition town movements that have put this particular plan together. And the culmination of a transition town movement is the adoption, the preparation and adoption of an energy descent action plan, and then implementing it and updating it on a year-by-year basis. If you look at the last link at the bottom of the page there, this is a link to Transition 2. It's an incredible documentary. I've posted it up on the discussion forums, but do have a look at it. And in particular, around about I think it's a 40-minute mark, there's an example of an energy descent, an energy relocation project. And what this community, transition community at Lewis has done in the UK, they've rented out the roof space of the local brewery, and they've reinvested some of their pension money. So they've invested locally. It's generating electricity, and it's going into the local energy grid, of course. But at the same time, they can see the investment on a daily basis. It's on the rooftop, it's green energy, and they feel healthy and happy that they can see the investment of their pension fund instead of it being squished away in some forgotten shopping center in the first world that's just based on consumption. And then some of the related movements to Transition Town is the degrowth initiatives. I won't go into this in detail, but they've also given birth to Simplicity Institute from Australia, and then the International Society for Ecological Economics. And then there's some amazing books about degrowth and sacred economics there. The important thing about this slide is that this ecological dimension is not a standalone dimension. We need to create strong linkages, as you will find out through the other dimensions, that the ecology, economics, and social components are all interrelated. And then the worldview is what caps it all over. And so we do need to integrate all these ideas together, especially economics and ecology. I'll let you guys research these links in your own steam, except to say that the ecological economics, there's a slideshow that I'll upload with some practical examples of how this can be achieved. So look out for that in the next module. And I think from here onwards, I'm going to, now one last slide, just an overview of renewable energies. As you can see, we've got wind, micro hydro, energy efficiencies, solar energy, biodigesters, and then also the moon phases. You know, if you look at the tides, that's all moon related. Let's harness this energy as best as we can. And then just one example I'll share with you. They're looking at ecological economics. But here's the layout of a school. So this is a brand new school that was built. And the engineers, when they designed it, they had pretty much a linear approach, meaning that there was a slight slope falling this way, and that all the stormwater was going to be collected and driven off site, pretty much like the engineers do, as in pave it, pipe it, and pollute it. So I came along and directed the engineers. I gave them a site instruction and I said, you will redesign this and slow it down, spread it, and sink it. And they did that. So they turned the stormwater pipes into swales. These are the swales you see here. So we were slowing it down, sinking it, and spreading it and sinking it. And on the downside, we planted, in fact, all the trees for the school. So that was adding value to the natural capital. Then the next thing we did, we had all these independent rainwater tanks. And I instructed them to throw away the taps here and reconnect them or reticulate them. So all the tanks were joined up, and all the tanks were joined up and they fed to this local low area where we had a couple of rainwater holding tanks. And then from there, we pumped up to a header tank and we gravity fed down the water that was used in the ablutions and wash hand basins. So here was our closed loop water cycle, and we didn't need any external water supplying the school at all because we had enough water from the rooftops. Now, what we would have done, or we're going to look out for next time, is introducing a biogas digester. So all the sewage can be gobbled up in there, produces methane for the school kitchen, and also for heating the geysers and that. And then on the social and human capital is creating a small permaculture garden where we teach the kids how to grow good, healthy organic food. They take the seeds home and they start establishing healthy homestead gardens. So this is an example of the four capitals. We've got two elements right. The other two are future enhancements. And at this stage, I'd like to hand over to Jacqueline to carry on about sustainable energy alternatives. So Jacqueline, over to you here. Hi, Jacqueline.
Sorry.
Okay.
I'd just like to round off with a few examples after Ezio's magnificent talk there, with some examples of really, really simple, low impact energy and some combinations of community energy, which I think are particularly important aspects of our decision-making process when we're thinking about energy provision. Here, I want to point to a place in India called the Barefoot College, which was created by a rather inspiring person called Bunker Roy and his equally inspiring colleagues and all of the people he trains there. He trains people in very, very simple solar technology, and he particularly likes training grandmothers. He calls it his grandmother university. What they do is they take, or they did take the first time around, a small group of women from the local area, and they trained them how to build a parabolic solar cooker, which is quite simple to build. It's about 300 mirrors that, when you fit them together in a particular way, will reflect the sun's rays onto the bottom of a cooking pot, which is strategically placed. You need to do some very precise calculations if you're not going to burn yourself, but once the knowledge has been passed on, these women can cook their food with solar energy without a huge infrastructure, without electricity. And also that means that they don't have to spend hours a day foraging for scraps of wood in an area which has been seriously deforested. It also means that they don't have to use kerosene, which is polluted and which of course comes from, it's a derivative of the fossil fuels. But he went on even further to train more people. So he trains a small group of women and he sends them home and they train more people. And he has taken women from Africa, trained a small group of women, send them home. They light up their village by building solar powered lamps and through these solar cookers, and then they send out people to teach women in other villages. And so, as you can see from the map up there, they have now been training what he calls barefoot solar technicians in 83 different countries. I find this type of initiative so important because you don't need a great deal of resources to do this. You just need some good planning and some willing people and a small amount of funding. In the bottom right-hand corner, there's a very different type of solar cooker, which is very simple. You can do it anywhere where there's a lot of sunlight. So it's really just a box. You can use aluminium foil, for example, to heat it up and cook a pan of rice or soup or anything in there. So it couldn't really get much simpler. But once again, you know, women using these type of cookers in Africa in particular have been able to replace the kerosene they use, which creates noxious fumes. Ezio, the next slide, please. The eco-village Tamera in Portugal is a place of great experimentation, not only with energy, but with the climate. They've done some magnificent work with Sepp Holzer in recreating rainfall and ground cover and trees out of an area which was seriously in the process of desertification. But they are striving continuously to find low impact but very innovative solutions to pump water, to cook, and to provide small amounts of electricity. So, for example, they have the Sun Pulse water pump, which is a solar water pump. It uses, once again, the same principle as the solar cooker. It's like a Schleifer mirror. The heat from the sun powers a Stirling engine. It's translated into a Stirling engine, which then can pump water from the ground. And there's zero emissions involved. Once you have the equipment, it would just keep on going. And this is a very innovative combination of already existing technologies. One of the things that they came up with a few years ago that I found really quite exciting in the sense that it was so imaginative was a way to cook by heating oil. So you can see in the bottom right-hand corner here that they have a greenhouse, and what they have done is they put pipes over the south-facing side of the greenhouse, and there is vegetable oil in the pipes. So they have increased the intensity of the heat on the pipes by putting Fresnel concentrators there. So glass which has ridges on it, which intensifies the solar radiation. So this heats the vegetable oil in the pipes to a very high temperature and the oil flows through the pipes, it can flow through water tanks. So it heats water for showers and for cleaning. But in the kitchen as well, they developed a type of cooker in which hot water was used as a cooking medium. And of course, the oil just keeps circulating. It's never used. You don't need to throw it away or anything like that. So these are two examples of how you can just use your imagination to come up with these quite innovative new technologies at very low cost and very low impact. Next one, please. This is one of my favourite places. It's the Isle of Egg off the west coast of Scotland. It is an island. The community bought the island themselves, so it's a community-owned island, which means that they can do quite a lot of things that other communities in Scotland can't do, and elsewhere in the world as well. So they decided to create a community-owned energy company. They did get funding from the European Commission to do it. They kept it small scale so that the inhabitants, there are now 100 inhabitants on the island altogether, made an agreement that they were going to reduce their level of consumption. And they put in 4 small wind turbines on one side of the island, and they are small. They're not these really massive, great things that tower up into the sky. That provides part of the energy, which travels to a station where they have batteries. They also have some solar panels, 50 kilowatts of photovoltaic, which also feeds into the batteries. And they have 6 small scale hydroelectric. So these just on streams that run downhill naturally, very small streams, so it's very small, but it does mean that if the wind stops blowing, which is very unlikely actually off the west coast of Scotland, but it does happen, and if the sun stops shining, which is much more likely, then there will always be some hydroelectricity on a small scale being fed into the system. And this is a system that has been working very well. I've spent quite a lot of time on eggs, so I know that it does work very well. They don't go without things. I mean, they all have washing machines and electric kettles, and they have quite a lot of tourism as well, so that's accommodated. They have small businesses, and so they have limited themselves deliberately in order to have a system which is quite low impact, but which is reliable because it relies on 3 different sources of energy feeding into the batteries. So I think that's a really good example if you're thinking about community energy, community-owned energy, and also one which I think is very good because it uses the local conditions. I mean, we don't get much sunshine in Scotland, that's true, but the wind and the hydro is always there. So they have chosen a complement of different sources, which is very much adapted to the local weather conditions. Next one, please, Ezio. Clough Jordan Eco Village in Ireland is a relatively new eco village, so they really did start everything from scratch quite recently. They have quite an interesting system for heating. So they have these solar thermal, the panels at the bottom right-hand corner, that is not photovoltaic, it's solar thermal. So there are copper pipes inside there which are capturing heat from the sun. And even in an Irish climate where there isn't a huge amount of sun, they do actually capture a great deal of heat. And that is fed into a system in which each house gets hot water and heating from this solar thermal, but it's also in combination. So once again, you have 2 complementary systems ensuring that you always have provision. The other one is a system which is burning wood chips at the moment. So it's biomass, and it's burning it to create the hot water. At the moment, what they're doing is they're bringing the biomass in from a sawmill, which is about 50 kilometers away. And so it's waste from the sawmill, which would otherwise just be thrown away. So they're bringing that in, but they think that 50 kilometers is a bit too far for their wood chips to travel. And so what they want to do is they want to talk to local farmers to do a deal with them. So the farmers will replant hedgerows, and the hedgerows will be willow, which is quite fast growing and grows very well in that climate, which is quite damp. And then they will buy wood chips from willow wood chips from the farmers to supply their boiler, the hot water boiler. And this is a very good deal all around. It's very much, I think, in the community spirit, because they are going to be then helping local farmers to get some extra cash. And on top of that, they're going to be making a contribution to returning biodiversity, because the willow hedges will be growing and cut in rotation, but they will, in the meantime, be providing habitats and forage for a whole range of insects and small mammals and birds. So this type of community system is also a very good example of a community thinking their way through things, making combinations, and choosing what is best for a holistic approach, which is best for the bioregion. Next one, please. I think this one is you, Ezio.
Okay, so
this is the Champagne method.
Yeah.
That's what you were going to do this one.
So I found this very inspiring about creating a proper compost pile that works, and you just wrap a couple of pipes around it, and you can virtually heat up water, and that will be more than enough water for your home. But he figured out a way of creating biogas as well, and his whole approach was pretty holistic. You know, he saw that living in that particular place of France, it was fairly dry forests, and they were susceptible to wildfires. So he thought, what can you do about the environment? So he started trimming the excess branches from this forest and reusing it for making compost. He used to wood chip it. So his contribution was really for the environment, agriculture, and in so doing, the byproducts that came out of that was energy. So he pretty much had a closed loop system. And a lot of permaculturists have written up about it. You can see the web links there. There's some original, there's his website, Jean Payne, and also a YouTube clip of his from many, many years ago. And I've seen this in action in just a very small compost pile here that you see in the bottom right-hand corner, which was only 3 meters long, 1.5 meters wide, and about 1 meter high. And it had this one water pipe coming in, water supply, just in that 3 meter long section. The water coming out here was pretty hot to shower in. So imagine if the farmer here hadn't have put a straight pipe. If he had wormed this pipe around, it would have had more surface area to heat up. And the ensuing hot water is more than enough you need to shower for a family or so. And as this compost breaks down, you just rebuild it up again to cover up the pipe. And this is pretty much what he did with this with his approach. So if you have got the time, do look into it. There are some mini-scale versions of this approach. You can even use it in suburban areas. And remember, in the Module 2 upload of documents, there was the Howard Higgins Hotbox composting solution, which looked at a cubic meter container to create compost. You can also put your coiled pipes in there, and that will generate enough heat to give you a nice shower without relying on mains electricity. So that's the last slide. I know it was quite long this evening. We hadn't intended making it that long, but I think energy is such an interesting topic that if we don't get this right, it will be the end of us. So I think at this stage, let's just see if there's any pressing questions. Jacqueline, are you seeing any comments?
No, there are no questions at the moment.
Okay.
I think we have probably exhausted everybody.
We've got a question here from Nadia. Is the Champagne method used in larger scales by towns and regions prone to forest fire?
The Champagne was worked in a forest somewhere in the south of France. So there's quite a lot of information about him in French, somewhere around the Provence region, I think it was. Yes, it is an area where it is prone to forest fire. I think that eventually he abandoned the work, if I recall. I haven't looked into his work for quite a few years now, but I think eventually he abandoned it. I mean, this was back in the 60s and early 70s. Because he needed too much of the material from the forest to build these huge stacks of composting material. Of course, that doesn't really mean that it doesn't work. I've seen other people doing it on a small scale, and I went to a permaculture conference in Belgium in, when was it, 2012, I think it was, where it was at a local farm, and what they did was they ran a rubber hose through a compost pile, and they provided 200 warm showers, enough for 200 people to have a warm shower 2 days running just from one compost heap. So there's potential there, but I'm not entirely sure about Champagne's, how feasible that is at scale.
I'd say definitely for a small holding or even a small garden, you can set up your cubic meter hot box, and that will give you enough heated water to accomplish quite a bit there.
Yes, there's a question that keeps coming back about geothermal. Where would it fall on the scale that you were talking about of comparison?
I must say, no one's actually, I haven't seen it on a graph, but I know that Iceland is energy neutral because they rely totally on geothermal. So their energy footprint is basically zero. They're not, it's a difficult thing to regenerate though, because it just seemingly comes up forever. But I'm sure that even if everyone had to adopt that worldwide, we would run out of it pretty soon. Or in other words, we'd have to drill deeper and deeper to get to it. And that's where the energy return and energy invested doesn't start making sense anymore.
There were plans in France about 10 years ago to build a huge electricity generation plant in the Pyrenees based on geothermal energy. And I saw the website with all the designs, and they were going to dig very deep and pull up hot water and then use the steam to drive turbines that generate the electricity. But I don't really know exactly how feasible it was or if they went ahead with it. I do know somebody, I've seen one example of a project in Bordeaux or just outside Bordeaux, somebody who had installed geothermal in his house. And besides the geothermal, he just had, what do they call them? A wood burning stove in the living room. For the rest of the hot water for the radiators, and everything came from geothermal. And he was quite happy with that, but it's the only time I've actually ever seen it in operation.
Yeah, apparently there's a house that I know of in the village and now in Italy where they drilled down 400 meters. And we're sitting at about 10 meters above sea level, but they've gone down 400 meters and have hit some very, very, very hot water. So they've got permanent hot water in their house, which drives all their internal heating and their showers. But what's the cost of this 400-meter borehole, you could say? They've obviously taken the long view. They're going to be living in this area, for a long time, and they've discounted it over that period, and they're happy with their return. But I think it depends on where you are and the choices that you make. If you've got geothermal just sitting underneath your surface, then make use of it. And if it's too deep down, then obviously your cost of extracting that energy is going to be higher. But also remember that you're depleting the water table if it is geothermal and water heat. So what other water are you going to put back in there? So there's a lot of variables to think about.
I think as well, with everything, and geothermal is a good example, it depends very much on what your local authorities and your government want. France is a very good example in this respect, because the project I was just talking about, the geothermal electricity generating plant in the Pyrenees, would have been then controlled by EDF, which is the state-controlled energy company. It's nuclear at the moment, the energy in France, but they're very, very keen on centralized energy control. And you see the same happening in Britain, that they've stopped giving subsidies to people who want to put up wind turbines, and instead they have been trying to build more nuclear power stations, the government at Westminster, because they're keen on keeping energy provision centralized. Whereas I would say that if you look at a community like Egg, it's very interesting that they are taking control of their own community energy provision, and with Clough Jordan as well. That means that they have to understand the responsibilities as well as the benefits, and that they have obligations to the people who live there, all of them together collectively, but also to the local environment. So, another aspect of this problem with energy is, centralized, state-controlled, or decentralized, regionally controlled, community-controlled, or even, off-grid and individual.
Okay. I think we've exhausted ourselves this evening. I think should we wrap it up here, Jacqueline?
Yes, definitely.
We stop recording. But we thank everyone for their participation, and if there's any more burning questions, just send Jacqueline and myself a query by email, and we'll take it from there. So thank you very much for your participation, and good night.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.